Vance stood at the edge of the dusty battlefield, his boots sinking slightly into the cracked earth beneath him. The air was thick with tension, as if the very ground beneath his feet could sense the weight of the coming conflict. The sun, setting on the horizon, cast long shadows over the barren landscape, turning the dust into a golden haze. It was a scene he had seen countless times before, yet this time, something was different. Something was off. He had been a soldier for years now, stationed on this forsaken planet at the edge of human territory. The planet, once home to thriving colonies, was now nothing more than a scarred landscape, constantly under attack by the alien forces that sought to take it from them. Humanity had built its last stand here, and for all its promises of victory, it had become nothing more than a desperate attempt to hold back the inevitable. Vance had seen war. He had lived through it, breathed it, and felt it in his bones. But nothing had prepared him for the challenge that was about to arrive. An army of unknown size and strength was marching toward their outpost, led by a warlord whose name sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned soldiers. The name had become synonymous with death and destruction. A ruthless alien warlord, feared across galaxies for his brutal tactics and unwavering will to conquer. The reports that had come in earlier were clear. Korak was coming, and he wasn't interested in negotiations or surrender. He had come for blood, and he was bringing an army to ensure he got it. Vance had known the day was coming. He had prepared for it, as much as anyone could. But still, as the minutes passed and the distant sound of marching feet grew louder, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in his gut. He adjusted the grip on his weapon, his fingers tightening around the familiar metal as if the gun was an extension of himself. It had seen him through many battles, and he had come to trust it more than anything else in this forsaken world. The soldiers around him were preparing as well. They checked their gear, ran through drills, and whispered among themselves. Most of them were younger than him, wide-eyed and full of hope, still believing they could win. But Vance knew better. He had seen enough battles to know that hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed under the weight of reality. As he stood there, staring into the distance, a figure approached from behind. It was Commander Harris, the leader of their small unit. Harris had been with Vance from the beginning, through every skirmish, every setback, and every victory. He was a man of few words but sharp instincts, and Vance trusted him more than anyone else. "Vance," Harris said, his voice low and serious. "He's here." Vance turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Korak?" Harris nodded.
"Yes. His army is on the move."
"We'll have to fight him here." Vance glanced at the horizon again, his mind racing. There was no telling how many soldiers Korak had with him. The reports had said the warlord's forces were vast, spread across several planets. But that was just rumor, hearsay. No one really knew what Korak's army looked like, and that was the scariest part. It could be 10,000 strong or just a few hundred. Either way, they were outmatched. "Get the men ready," Vance said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. "We don't have much time." As Harris turned to relay the orders, Vance took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the tattoo on his neck, the one he had carried with him for so long. The mark was a symbol of a past he had long tried to forget, one he could never escape. It was a reminder of a mission, a failed rebellion, and a truth buried deep within him. The tattoo was more than just ink on skin. It was a story, one that no one else knew. No one except him. But now, standing on the battlefield, Vance wondered if the past was finally catching up to him. He had tried to outrun it for years, but this felt different. The sound of footsteps approached, pulling Vance from his thoughts. It was the rest of the team, gathered and ready for what was to come. They were young, eager, and full of energy, as soldiers always were before a fight. Some of them had never seen real combat. Others had only known the endless struggle of holding the line against alien forces. They all looked to Vance for guidance, for strength, but in this moment, he wasn't sure he had anything left to give. The distant rumble of Korak's army grew louder, echoing through the valley. Vance's mind raced with memories of battles fought long ago, of enemies vanquished and victories won, but none of them felt like they mattered now. Nothing seemed to matter in this moment, except the tattoo, the warlord, and the looming confrontation that he knew would change everything. The soldiers took their positions, spreading out along the ridge to prepare for the assault. Vance stood at the front, looking down at the battlefield below. His heart beat steadily, but his thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to fight this fight, but there was no other choice. The sun was setting now, casting the battlefield in a dim orange glow. It was the calm before the storm, and Vance could feel it in his bones. He looked back at the soldiers one last time, his eyes scanning their faces. Some were scared, others were eager, but all of them were ready. They had to be. Suddenly, the sound of a voice broke through the tension in the air. It was booming, echoing over the valley like a thunderclap. "You have 1 hour to surrender," the voice said, dripping with arrogance and power. "If you do not comply, we will show you what it means to fight Korak." Vance's jaw clenched. It was a challenge, pure and simple. Korak wasn't interested in negotiations. He wanted war. And Vance knew deep down that this battle was not just about defending the planet. It was about facing something far more personal, something he had been running from for years. He turned to Harris, who was standing beside him, waiting for orders. Vance nodded grimly. "Tell the men to prepare for the worst." As Harris went to relay the orders, Vance stood tall, staring at the horizon. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. His past had caught up to him. The tattoo on his neck was no longer just a mark. It was a symbol of everything he had tried to forget. And now it was about to define his future. Vance sat on a rocky outcrop, his mind heavy with thoughts he had long tried to bury. The sun had set, and the battlefield was bathed in the pale light of a crescent moon. The air was cold, biting through the thin fabric of his uniform. His fingers absently traced the tattoo on his neck, the marks still sharp in his memory. He could almost feel the old wounds reopening as he thought back to the mission that had scarred him all those years ago. The tattoo had always been a reminder, a part of him he couldn't erase no matter how hard he tried. But now, in the middle of a war he hadn't chosen, it was a constant reminder that he wasn't just a soldier. He was someone else, someone with a past that Korak recognized, someone who had played a role in shaping the future of an entire galaxy. That name, Korak, had haunted him for years. It wasn't just a name of a warlord. It was the name of someone who had been on the other side of a rebellion, a battle that had gone terribly wrong. Korak wasn't some faceless enemy. He was part of Vance's history, a history that had ended in fire, destruction, and loss. They had fought on opposite sides, and now they were once again on a collision course. But this time, things felt different. Vance could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The tattoo was more than just a symbol of a failed mission. It was a mark of identity, a reminder of everything Vance had once been and everything he had lost. That symbol wasn't just something he had earned. It was something forced upon him, something that bound him to a past he couldn't outrun. Korak had been there, back when the rebellion was fresh, when hopes were high, and the future seemed bright. Vance had been a part of something bigger than himself, working as a special operative in a covert mission to infiltrate the heart of an empire, to expose its secrets and bring it to its knees. It was supposed to be the beginning of the end, the moment when everything changed, but things had gone horribly wrong. He could still remember the final moments, the chaotic violence, and the betrayal. Korak had been there, leading his forces against the rebels, and it had been a fight Vance and his comrades weren't prepared for. There had been no warning, no chance to escape. The alien forces had overrun them, slaughtering everyone in their path. Vance had barely escaped with his life, the tattoo on his neck being the only thing to remind him of the fate he had narrowly avoided. In the years that followed, Vance had done everything he could to distance himself from that past. He had taken on new missions, joined new units, and buried the memories deep inside. The tattoo, though, remained. It was a part of him, a part he couldn't erase, no matter how far he ran. And now Korak was back. Vance stood up, brushing the dirt and dust from his pants. The sound of footsteps approaching interrupted his thoughts. It was Harris, the commander of the unit, who had been with Vance through the hardest battles, his loyalty unwavering. They had been through countless skirmishes together, but this was different. "Vance," Harris said, his voice grave. "We need to talk." Vance turned to face him, his expression unreadable. He could see the concern in Harris's eyes, but there was something more there, something darker.
"I know what you're thinking," Harris continued. "This is about the past, isn't it?"
About Korak? Vance didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The past wasn't something he could easily talk about. Not with anyone, least of all Harris. But the fact that Korak had recognized the tattoo meant that everything was coming to a head. The secrets he had tried to keep buried were rising to the surface, and there was no stopping them now. "You don't have to say anything," Harris said, stepping closer. "I know you're trying to keep your distance from this. I know you want to focus on the fight, but we can't pretend like this isn't personal." Vance sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "It's not that simple, I know," Harris said. "But I'm worried. Korak doesn't just know who you are. He knows what you are."
"What you've done? And that tattoo?"
"It means something to him, doesn't it?" Vance nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he thought about the warlord's reaction when he had first seen the tattoo. "It's a symbol," he muttered, "a mark of what happened. A reminder of who I used to be." Harris was silent for a moment, processing the words. "You've always kept your distance from that life, but I think it's time to face it.
Whatever's coming, it's not just about us fighting for this planet. Korak is here for something more."
"He wants answers, and
I think he's going to try to use you to get them."
Vance shook his head. "He wants me dead, not as an ally. That much is clear." "No," Harris said, his voice firm. "He might have been your enemy once, but now it's different. He's looking for something, and I think you might be the key to it." Vance turned away, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and memories. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted to go back to that life, to confront the mistakes and decisions that had brought him here. But Korak was pushing him, forcing him to face the truth he had long denied. The sounds of the alien army grew louder in the distance, the rhythmic marching growing closer, like a storm on the horizon. Vance felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, the pressure of knowing that there was no way out of this. No matter how hard he tried to resist, the past would always be a part of him. He glanced at Harris, who stood watching him, waiting for an answer. Vance knew what he had to do. There was no running from this fight. There was no running from Korak. He took a deep breath and turned back to face the approaching army. "We'll fight," he said, his voice cold and resolute. "But this isn't just about saving the planet. It's about settling something that should have been settled a long time ago." Harris nodded, understanding the weight of Vance's words. He didn't need to ask what it meant. They both knew that this battle would be different from any other. This was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for redemption, for closure, and for the chance to finally put the past to rest. The army was almost upon them now, the sound of footsteps and war cries filling the air. Vance could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, as if the entire universe was holding its breath. He knew that the moment Korak stepped onto the battlefield, it would all come to a head. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending. This was it. The past and the present were colliding, and there was no turning back. Vance straightened his posture, the tattoo on his neck a constant reminder of everything he had lost. He wasn't the man he had once been, but he knew one thing for sure. He would fight to the end, no matter the cost. The night was thick with tension, the air heavy and still. Vance stood at the edge of the ridge, his gaze fixed on the horizon where Korak's army was slowly advancing. The distant lights of the alien forces flickered like fireflies in the dark, each step drawing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. The soldiers around him were tense, their hands gripping weapons, their eyes darting from one to another, uncertain of what to expect. But Vance knew. He knew exactly what was coming, and he couldn't stop it. He felt a sense of calm wash over him, though it wasn't the peace of acceptance. It was the cold clarity of someone who had already made peace with their fate. The battle ahead wouldn't be won by hope or strength alone. It would be won by resolve, by the willingness to fight, not just for survival, but for something more. And that was something Vance had to remind himself of every single day. His past with Korak had never been more than a ghost, something buried deep within him, never to see the light of day. But now it had returned with a vengeance. The tattoo on his neck, the mark of his past, had somehow pulled them both into this moment. Korak's recognition of it, the shock in his eyes, had revealed that Vance was more than just a soldier. He was a key, a part of a history long forgotten. And the warlord wanted answers. Vance didn't know exactly what Korak was after, but he knew that it wasn't going to be as simple as a fight to the death. The alien warlord had seen something in Vance that Vance hadn't fully understood himself. He was no longer just a man caught between worlds. He was a man tied to a forgotten legacy, a legacy that could change everything. As the army below gathered into formation, Vance glanced over his shoulder at the small group of soldiers behind him. Harris was there, his expression firm, his jaw set in determination. The others, too, were ready, some nervous, others eager. They trusted Vance, and in turn, he had come to trust them. But trust wouldn't win this battle. The truth would. "Get in position," Vance said, his voice steady but low, as if the words themselves could somehow steady his nerves. "We don't know what Korak's planning, but we need to be ready for anything." Harris nodded, giving a sharp whistle to rally the troops. The soldiers moved swiftly, taking their positions along the ridge. Vance stayed at the front, his eyes never leaving the advancing army. He could feel the weight of the tattoo on his neck, as if it were burning him, reminding him of the past he had tried so hard to forget. The sound of marching grew louder, until the ground seemed to tremble beneath Vance's feet. He closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the noise, focusing only on his breath. It was a tactic he had learned in the worst of battles, to center himself, to focus on the here and now, and forget the fear. There would be no time for fear in this fight. The first of Korak's forces crested the ridge, their alien armor gleaming in the moonlight. They were a sight to behold, tall, imposing figures, their bodies covered in sleek metallic plates that reflected the dim light like 1,000 shards of glass. Their weapons were strange, alien, and deadly. But Vance wasn't afraid, not anymore. The silence was deafening as Korak's army lined up, their leader at the front, his figure unmistakable even from a distance. Korak's eyes locked onto Vance the moment they made eye contact. There was no mistake. Korak knew exactly who he was, and the recognition in his eyes was almost too much to bear. Korak's voice rang out, deep and commanding. "Vance!" he called, his tone low, almost a growl. "I knew it was you. The marks on your neck, they tell a story, one I thought I'd forgotten." Vance didn't move, his eyes never leaving the warlord. "What do you want, Korak?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "We're not here for your games." Korak's lips curled into a smile, one that was both sinister and knowing. "You never were a man of games, were you?" "No, you're far more than that, Vance. You always have been." Vance's hand tightened around the grip of his weapon. He didn't know what Korak was playing at, but whatever it was, he wasn't about to let the warlord think for 1 second that he had control of this moment. "I came here to end this," Korak continued, stepping forward.
To put an end to the legend you started. You know why I'm here.
You were once one of us. You were part of something much bigger than this. Bigger than this pathetic little rebellion you've been fighting. You've always been part of the bigger picture. You just don't know it yet. Vance's mind raced, but he didn't show it. Korak was trying to manipulate him, to make him believe there was something more to this than just a battle for survival, but Vance knew better. The past was behind him. It had to be.
What's the game, Korak? Vance said, his voice sharp.
You don't get to rewrite history. You don't get to drag me back into whatever twisted plan you have. The warlord's smile faltered, replaced by something far darker. He took another step forward, his eyes locked onto Vance's tattoo. You don't understand, do you? This tattoo, it's a symbol. A mark of the past. A past that could change the future. And I think you know what I'm talking about. Vance felt a chill run down his spine. Korak's words sent ripples of fear through him. Fear he had tried to bury for so long. Was it possible? Could the tattoo really mean something more than just a reminder of a failed mission? Korak was no fool. He knew the truth. He had always known it. But Vance was too stubborn, too proud to admit it. He had run from the past for so long, thinking he could escape it. But now, it seemed the past had caught up to him. Before Vance could respond, Korak raised his hand, signaling his forces. The soldiers moved in, their weapons raised. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Let's end this, then, Vance said, his voice steady, the weight of his words hanging in the air. There was no going back now. He would fight for humanity. He would fight for the truth. And if that meant facing his past head-on, then so be it. The two armies stood facing one another, the final battle beginning to unfold. Vance could feel the adrenaline rushing through his veins, but there was no room for hesitation. This fight wasn't just for survival. It was for redemption. It was for the chance to finally put the past to rest and move forward. Korak's forces surged forward, and the ground shook as the first wave of battle began. The sound of weapons clashing, the screams of the fallen filled the air, but Vance kept his focus. His eyes never left Korak, the warlord who had once been his enemy, the man who now held the key to a past that was threatening to consume him. This was it, the moment when everything changed. The past was no longer something Vance could ignore. It was something he had to face, something he had to fight for, and no matter the cost, he would. The ground beneath Vance's boots shook as the battle raged around him. The clash of metal, the hum of energy weapons, and the cries of soldiers filled the air, creating a chaotic symphony of war. His eyes never left Korak, who stood at the heart of the alien forces, directing them with the precision of a man who had led countless campaigns. Every movement was deliberate, every command executed with authority. Korak wasn't just a warlord. He was a force of nature, and Vance knew that if he was going to end this, it had to be now. Vance moved swiftly through the chaos, dodging blasts of energy and weaving between his soldiers as they fought to hold the line. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was calm. He had been in battles before, countless times, but this one was different. This battle wasn't just about surviving. It was about something much deeper. It was about confronting the past and putting an end to a story that had never truly been finished. Korak's voice rang out again, deep and commanding, cutting through the noise of the battlefield. "You can't escape this, Vance! You can't outrun your fate!" Vance's eyes narrowed. He wasn't going to let Korak play on his fears anymore. This was the moment. He had to face the warlord once and for all, and settle everything between them. The fight wasn't just a war between two armies. It was a war for control over the future. Vance had been running from the past for so long, but now he had no choice but to confront it. The tattoo on his neck, the mark of his history, had become the symbol of everything he had tried to leave behind. Korak's recognition of it, the way the warlord had looked at him in disbelief, had reminded Vance of who he used to be, and for the first time, Vance realized that he couldn't run anymore. He had to face the truth. The soldiers around him fought fiercely, but the alien forces were too strong. Vance's heart clenched as he watched several of his men fall, their bodies hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The weight of their loss pressed down on him, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let their deaths be in vain. Through the smoke and the chaos, Vance spotted Korak, standing tall amidst his soldiers, the warlord's dark armor gleaming in the dim light. The warlord's eyes locked onto Vance's, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. It was as if the world had paused, as if the two of them were the only ones left. This was the moment that would decide everything, the moment when the past and the present collided. Vance knew what he had to do. He didn't need to waste any more time with words. There was no negotiation, no bargaining with Korak. He would fight, and he would end this. There was no turning back now. With a sharp breath, Vance sprinted forward, his weapon raised, his mind focused. The soldiers around him parted, giving him room to move. He could hear Korak's voice again, the warlord's deep laughter cutting through the air. But Vance didn't listen to it. He didn't have time for it. He reached Korak in what felt like an instant, his boots hitting the ground with a powerful thud. The warlord raised his weapon, and their blades clashed with a deafening crack, sending sparks flying into the air. The force of the impact sent shock waves through Vance's arms, but he didn't falter. He pushed back with everything he had, his strength matched only by the rage building inside him. "You don't understand, do you?" Korak spat, his voice low and full of fury. "You are nothing more than a tool, Vance, a weapon. You were never meant to be free. You were always part of the plan." Vance gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on his weapon. "I'm not your pawn anymore, Korak." "And I never was." Korak sneered, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You think you can escape this? You think you can escape the legacy of what you started? I am the future, Vance. I am the end of your rebellion." The warlord swung his blade in a wide arc, aiming for Vance's head. Vance ducked just in time, feeling the whoosh of the weapon as it passed over him. He countered with a swift strike, aiming for Korak's side. The warlord blocked it effortlessly, but the force of Vance's blow pushed him back a few steps. "You're wrong," Vance said through gritted teeth, sweat dripping down his brow. "This isn't about legacy. This is about right and wrong. And I'm going to make sure you never get the chance to destroy everything we've fought for." Korak's expression twisted into one of pure malice. "You're just a broken soldier, Vance. A man lost in time, nothing more." The warlord lunged again, his blade aimed straight for Vance's heart. Vance parried the blow, their weapons clashing with a violent shockwave that rattled him to the core. He pushed back with all his might, shoving Korak off balance. In that split second of vulnerability, Vance saw his opportunity. He struck. His weapon pierced through Korak's armor, sinking deep into the warlord's chest. The alien leader let out a guttural roar, his eyes wide with shock, but it was too late. The wound was fatal. Korak staggered backward, his weapon falling from his hand. The warlord collapsed to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps as blood pooled beneath him. Vance stood over him, panting, his heart racing in his chest. The battle raged on around them, but for Vance, everything had stopped. This was the end. Korak was defeated. The warlord who had haunted him for so long was no more. "You were never the future, Korak," Vance muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were just a shadow of what could have been." The warlord's eyes flickered one last time, a mixture of disbelief and fury in his gaze. But then, slowly, his body went limp, and the light in his eyes faded. Vance stood there for a moment, staring down at the man who had been his greatest enemy. there was no satisfaction in the victory. There was no joy in the death, only the cold weight of what had been done. As the sounds of battle slowly died down around him, Vance looked up at the soldiers, who were now regrouping. His men were still fighting, still holding the line, but the tide was turning. Korak's forces were retreating, their leader dead, their morale shattered. Vance turned and began walking back toward his unit, his body heavy with exhaustion. The battle was over, but the scars of it would remain. He had faced his past, confronted the demons he had long buried, and emerged victorious. But he knew that victory came at a cost. The tattoo on his neck, the symbol of his past, would never disappear. But now it no longer defined him. He was more than the man who had once been part of a failed rebellion. He was more than the soldier who had been dragged into a fight he didn't want. He was his own man, and the future was his to shape. As he reached his soldiers, they greeted him with nods of respect and relief. The battle had been hard, but they had made it through, and for the first time in years Vance felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.